Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back in time, and I mean way back, to a world that feels both foreign and strangely familiar. We're going to visit the Puritans in 17th century New England. This isn't your textbook history lesson, full of dates and dry treaties. Instead, you're going to experience it firsthand. You'll feel the chill in the air. You'll hear the whispers of your neighbors. And you'll quickly learn that falling asleep at the wrong moment could land you in some serious trouble. Frankly, your modern sensibilities might get you put in the stocks before lunchtime on day one. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, let me know in the comments what city you're here listening from, and what time it is for you right now. It's always fascinating to see where everyone is tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first thing you notice is the silence. For months, the world has been a symphony of groaning wood, the snap of canvas in the wind, and the relentless, slushing crash of waves against the hull. Now, that constant motion, that endless noise, is gone. The ship sits unnervingly still in the calm, grey water of the harbour. You've arrived. You climb onto the main deck, squinting at the shore. It's not the paradise of milk and honey some preachers might have vaguely promised. It's a dense, dark, and unbroken wall of tree. The wilderness looks absolute. It seems to swallow the light, promising nothing but hardship and secrets. A thin plume of smoke rises from somewhere beyond the tree line, the only sign of human life. The air you breathe for the first time is sure, clean, and fiercely cold. It smells of salt, damp earth, and pine needles, a scent so potent it feels like you can taste the very essence of this new continent. Your turn comes. You shuffle forward in a line of weary travelers, your boots scuffing on the worn planks. Stepping off the gangplank onto the soil of the new world isn't a triumphant moment. Your foot sinks into cold, squelching mud that grabs at your ankle. The ground here is soft, unforgiving, and a perfect metaphor for your current situation. You are unsteady in every sense of the word. You look around at your fellow passengers. Their faces are gone, their skin pale from the long voyage, but it's their eyes that hold your attention. They are filled with a terrifying mixture of exhaustion, relief, and a severe, unyielding resolve. These people crossed an ocean not just for land, but for an idea. This is a core truth you need to grasp immediately. They didn't come here to build a land of religious freedom for all. They came here to build a society where they could practice their own intensely strict version of Protestantism. A city upon a hill that would be a beacon of purity for the rest of the world to see. This means that freedom, for you, is the freedom to conform. The rules are unspoken, but they hang in the air, thicker than the morning fog. As you venture further inland, towards the cluster of crude buildings that will be your new town, you realize how much of a stereotype the all-black attire of the Puritans is. While the magistrate and the minister are indeed clad in somber black, you notice touches of subdued color on others. A woman's petticoat is the color of rust. Another man wears a waistcoat of a deep, earthy green. This is a small, quiet fact that often gets lost in the popular image. They had colors, but they were meant to be modest, earthy, and never ostentatious. A bright yellow ribbon, or a flashy silver buckle would be more than just a fashion faux pas. It would be seen as a sign of vanity, a symptom of a soul in peril. You make a mental note to check your own limited wardrobe. You see the men of the colony, figures of authority like John Winthrop, directing the construction of a new meetinghouse. Their faces are grim, their movements purposeful. I'm standing here, a small, insignificant figure in this grand, difficult project. You can't help but wonder about their true motives. Was this entire, perilous venture born solely from an unshakable faith, a divine calling to create a new Jerusalem? Or were there other, more worldly forces at play? A desire for political autonomy away from the English crown, a chance to build personal fortunes, a grand social experiment cloaked in the language of Scripture. Historians are still debating the precise balance of piety and ambition that drove these leaders. For you, The debate is academic. The only thing you feel is the immense, crushing weight of their vision. You are a single brick in the wall of their holy city, and you are expected to fit perfectly. The sun begins to dip below the colossal trees, and the temperature drops sharply. The sounds of the forest begin to emerge, the snap of a twig, the distant cry of an unfamiliar bird, the low howl of the wind. Your first night is coming. It will be cold, long, and the beginning of a life where every action, every word, and perhaps even every thought will be judged. The fading light offers little comfort. You are led away from the growing shadow of the central meeting house, down a path that is less a road and more a suggestion carved into the mud. You are assigned a plot of land, not by choice, but by decree. On it stands your new home. It is a small, boxy structure of rough, graying timber, looking less like a house and more like a crate someone forgot to unpack. This is the piece of the new world you crossed an ocean for. You push open the heavy plank door, which groans in protest. The interior is a single, square room, dominated by a massive fireplace made of stone and clay that takes up nearly a whole wall. The floor is not made of wood, but of hard-minus packed earth, cold and damp under your feet. There are no windows in the modern sense, just small, square openings covered by wooden shutters that, when closed, will plunge the room into absolute darkness. Some of your slightly more affluent neighbors might have oiled paper covering their window openings, a translucent barrier that lets in a milky, depressing light but does little to stop the wind. Glass is a luxury reserved for the meeting house and the governor's home, a clear sign of status and importance. You stand in the center of the room, your breath misting in the air. This single space is your kitchen, your living room, and your bedroom. Your bed will be a simple straw stuffed mattress in the corner. If you're really lucky, your dining table will be a crude trestle you might have to build yourself. Privacy is an alien concept here. Every aspect of your life will unfold in this one small box, in full view of anyone who happens to walk past your unshuttered window or open door. And people will be looking. As you step back outside to survey your domain, you notice the town's layout. This is not a haphazard collection of dwellings. The settlement is deliberately unmeticulously planned. Your house, like all the others, faces the central common, a large, open green space. The meeting house sits at one end, a constant, looming reminder of its central role in your life. The houses are arranged in neat rows, close together, so close, in fact, that you can easily see into your neighbor's yard and they can see into yours. This is a classic feature of Puritan town planning. They weren't just building homes. They were engineering a community of mutual watchfulness. There is nowhere to hide. Your every coming and going, every visitor, the time you light your morning fire, it's all public information. Before you can even begin to process the sheer amount of work ahead, a figure detaches itself from the house next door. It's a woman, your neighbor, wiping her hands on her apron. She approaches not with a warm smile, but with an expression of intense, sober curiosity. "Good day to you," she says, her voice flat. "I am good wife Miller. The Lord has seen fit to place you beside us." You exchange pleasantries, but you can feel her eyes cataloguing everything about you, the weariness in your posture, the state of your clothes, the way you respond. Her questions are casual, but pointed. Have you skill in spinning? Are you accustomed to rising before dawn for prayer? Did you leave family in England? Each question is a probe, a small test designed to determine if you are pious, industrious, and, above all, compliant. She gestures to your vast, empty fireplace. "You'll need to keep a good fire," she says, a statement that sounds both like advice and a warning. If your hearth goes cold in the night, it is a great trial to relight it with flint and steel. Then she imparts a piece of truly vital information, a strange little cornerstone of this society. It is better to borrow hot coal from a neighbor. My door is open after morning prayers. This is the practice of borrowing fire, a mundane but critical part of daily life. A child or servant would be sent with a small pan to a neighbor's hearth to collect live embers to restart their own. It's a fascinating, almost charming detail of communal living. But, as she turns to leave, you realize the double edge of this simple courtesy. It's a system of support, yes, but it's also another layer of surveillance. If you consistently need to borrow fire, your neighbors will know you are a poor household manager, perhaps lazy or disorganized character flaws that have spiritual implications here. Your very ability to maintain a simple flame is a public measure of your virtue. You retreat back into your cold, dark hut. Standing there, you ponder the very nature of this community you've been dropped into. Is this intense, suffocating closeness a form of Christian charity, a support system designed to hold everyone together in the face of starvation in the vast, hostile wilderness? A way to ensure no one starves, no one freezes, and every inner soul is looked after? Or is it something else entirely rigid, powerful to love social control, meant to enforce absolute conformity and stamp out any spark of individuality before it can catch fire? Historians still argue about this, wrestling with the Puritans' own writings to determine whether their society was built more on a foundation of mutual love or one of mutual fear. From where you're standing, ankle-minus deep in mud and morel, it feels overwhelmingly like the latter. The silence of the room is broken only by the wind whistling through the cracks in the walls. It sounds like a whisper, and you get the distinct feeling that from this day forward, you will never truly be alone again. The first sign that Sunday has arrived is the quiet. The usual sounds of morning, the rhythmic thud of an axe splitting wood, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the distant chatter of men working are gone. There is only a profound, enforced silence. A single bell tolls from the meetinghouse. Its clear, cold tone cutting through the morning air. It's not an invitation, it's a summons. There is no lazing in bed, no slow start to the day. The Sabbath, or Lord's Day, is the most important day of the week, and its observance is not optional. It is the central pillar of your new life, and the rules are absolute. You put on your best clothes, which are simply your cleanest and least minus worn work clothes. You eat a cold meal, as cooking is considered work and is forbidden on the Sabbath. The mood in your small home, and in the entire town, is one of profound solemnity. You join the silent procession of figures making their way towards the meetinghouse. Entire families walk together, their faces grim and serious. There are no smiles, no idle chatter. This is business, the business of salvation. Stepping inside the meetinghouse is like entering a void. The interior is even starker than the outside. The walls are plain, unpainted wood. There are no paintings, no statues, no stained glass windows, no crucifixes. To the Puritan mind, such decorations were idolatrous distractions from the pure, unadorned Word of God. The only thing that matters here is the sermon. The room is filled with rows of hard, backless wooden benches. You quickly realize a strange and significant detail about the seating. You don't get to sit with your family. The congregation is segregated. Men sit on one side of the central aisle, women on the other. Children are often seated separately, sometimes in a gallery or on the stairs, where they can be watched. And within these divisions, there is a further hierarchy. Your seat is assigned to you by a town committee, based on your age, wealth, and social standing. The governor, the minister, and the town elders occupy the most prominent pews at the front, sometimes enclosed in their own wooden boxes to shield them from draught. The less important you are, the further back you sit, and the closer you are to the cold draught from the door. You are new, poor, and at the bottom of the ladder, so you find your designated spot on a rough bench near the rear. Your place in this society has been made physically, publicly clear. To sit in a seat not assigned to you would be an act of defiant pride, a punishable offense. A deep, bone-minus aching cold permeates the building. There is no central heating. Wealthier members might bring small, metal foot warmers, little boxes, holding hot coals from their hearths, which they place discreetly under their long skirts or coats. You have no such luxury. You can only curl your toes in your thin leather shoes and try to ignore the chill, seeping up from the floorboards. The minister, a formidable man in stout black robes, ascends the pulpit. He is the most educated and, arguably, the most powerful man in the community. He holds your eternal fate in his hands, and everyone knows it. He opens the Bible, places a heavy hand upon it, and begins to pray. The prayer itself is an endurance event, lasting for what feels like an hour. Then, without a break, he launches into the sermon, and this is the main event. If you're imagining a gentle, 20-minute homily about loving your neighbor, you are dangerously mistaken. Think of it as a mandatory 3-hour theological lecture, delivered in a stern monotone, with no breaks for water or stretching. The minister uses an hourglass, placed on the pulpit, to ensure he preaches for the required length of time. Sometimes, if HES, feeling particularly inspired, he'll flip it over and keep going. The subject matter is not designed for comfort. He speaks of predestination, the chilling doctrine that God has already chosen who will be saved and who will be damned, and there is nothing you can do to change it. He expounds on original sin, the inherent depravity of the human soul, and the constant, fiery threat of hell. It is dense, complex, and utterly terrifying. And it is, for you, incredibly hard to follow. After a week of back-breaking physical labor, with a belly full of cold corn mush, sitting on a hard bench in a freezing room, the minister's droning voice becomes a potent lullaby. Your head begins to nod. Your eyelids feel like they have lead weights attached. You jolt awake, your heart pounding with fear. You look around, terrified someone saw you. A man across the aisle gives you a sharp, disapproving glare. You force your eyes open, digging your fingernails into the palm of your hand to create a point of pain to focus on. You see a young boy a few rows ahead of you finally lose his battle, his head slumping onto his chest. Instantly, a man near him, you'll soon learn his official title, reaches out and raps the boy sharply on the head with a long wooden pole. The boy snaps upright, his face a mask of shame and terror. This is your first taste of the consequences. Dozing off during the sermon isn't just rude. It's a sign of a spiritual laxity. It's an insult to God and the community. It's a crime. As you sit there, fighting your own exhaustion, you scan the faces of the congregation. Are they all truly captivated by this intricate breakdown of Calvinist doctrine? Is every soul in this room hanging on the minister's every word, wrestling with the state of their immortal soul? Or are they, like you, simply enduring? Are they performing the role of the pious congregant because the social cost of not doing so is too high? Historians still debate this very question: to what extent was the average Puritan's behavior motivated by genuine, fervent faith versus the immense pressure of social conformity in a town where your every move was scrutinized? Finally, after an eternity, the hourglass runs out for the last time. The sermon ends, a brief, final prayer, and it's over. But the day is not. You are dismissed for a short lunch break again, cold and prepared yesterday before you are expected to return for a second, slightly shorter service in the afternoon. The Sabbath is a full-day marathon of piety. As you file out into the cold air, your legs stiff and your mind numb. You feel spiritually exhausted and more than a little afraid. You survived your first Sunday service, but you now understand that your moments of rest will be the most stressful part of your week. The man with the long wooden pole, he becomes a figure of morbid fascination for you. During the afternoon service, you find yourself watching him more than the minister. He moves with a quiet, deliberate authority, his eyes sweeping across the congregation like a hawk searching for field mice. He is the tithing man. His official title is a bit misleading. It has little to do with collecting tithes or monetary offerings. His job is far more personal. He is the spiritual enforcer of the congregation, the sheriff of the Sabbath. The position of tithing man was a real and incredibly important one in Puritan communities. Each tithing man was assigned to oversee about 10 families in his neighborhood. His duties extended beyond the walls of the meetinghouse, but it was here, during the long hours of worship, that his power was most visible. You watch him work. The pole he carries is not just a simple stick. It is a purpose mine is built to love shame. One end is tipped with a brass knob or a wooden foxtail, designed for rapping sleepy men on the head. The other end, however, is fitted with a feather, a bit of fur, or a dangling foxtail. This softer end is for the women. When he spies a woman or a young girl whose attention is drifting, he doesn't trap them. Instead, he gently but very deliberately tickles their nose or cheek with the feather. It's a less violent, but perhaps more humiliating way to be called out. The message is the same: I see you. God sees you. Wake up. You see him use both ends during the afternoon sermon. A farmer you recognize from the fields nods off, his chin dropping to his chest with a soft snore. The tithing man glides silently down the aisle, positions the pole, and wait. The sound is just loud enough to make heads turn. The farmer jolts awake, his face flushing a deep, mortified crimson. Later, a young woman, her head covered by a simple coif, lets her gaze wander towards the window. The feathered end of the pole appears as if from nowhere and tickles her under the chin. She flinches, startled, and immediately stares straight ahead at the pulpit, her cheeks burning with shame. This man's authority, you learn, doesn't end when the sermon does. He is responsible for his 10 families throughout the week. He's the one who ensures the children are being properly catechized, learning their religious doctrine. He's the one who reports unruly or idle servants to the magistrate. And he is especially vigilant on the Sabbath. If he catches you taking a leisurely stroll, loitering outside the meeting house, or doing any unnecessary work, even something as simple as sweeping your floor, he has the authority to report you to the authorities. You could face a fine or, worse, public admonishment. You get a first-hand look at this later in the week. Feeling cooped up in your small, dark house, you decide to take a short walk to the edge of the village, just to see the forest line up close. You're not gone for 10 minutes. As you walk back, you see the tithing man, Mr. Hopkins, standing outside his home, watching you. He doesn't smile or wave. He just watches. The next day, your neighbor, Goodwife Miller, mentions in a seemingly offhand way, Mr. Hopkins saw you walking yesterday evening. A restless spirit is a trial, is it not? The message is delivered. You were seen, you were noted, you are being monitored. This leads you to a curious and rather bizarre little corner of Puritan law, the silent observer. While the tithing man was an official post, some communities took this idea of mutual watchfulness even further. They would appoint individuals, sometimes called inspectors of youth or simply observers, whose sole job was to discreetly monitor the behavior of others, especially young people, and report any signs of sinfulness or frivolity. It was like having a secret police force dedicated to enforcing good morals. Their effectiveness relied on the fact that you never knew for sure who they were. It could be anyone. It could be the man who sells you grain. It could be the woman you borrow fire from. It could be the quiet child who sits near you in the meeting house. This culture of surveillance created a pervasive, low-minded level paranoia. People began to police their own behavior and the behavior of their family members to avoid even the appearance of impropriety. You start to understand why everyone looks so serious all the time. A hearty laugh at the wrong moment, a song hummed while you work, a colorful ribbon found on your daughter's dress. Any of these could be misinterpreted as a sign of a deeper spiritual corruption. You sit in your home, the fire crackling, and think about the tithing man's pole. It's such a strange, almost comical object. A stick with a feather on one end and a knob on the other. It seems like something out of a play, but here, it is a deadly serious instrument of power, and it makes you wonder about the mindset of the men who wielded it. Did they relish this power, this ability to publicly correct their neighbors? Did they see themselves as righteous instruments of God's will, dutifully tending to his flock? Or was it an unpleasant duty, a burden they bore for the good of the community? Historians who study the personal diaries and letters of these men find evidence for both. Some wrote of their duties with a heavy heart, while others seem to take a certain grim satisfaction in rooting out sin. For you, the academic debate is less important than the practical reality. The reality is that there is a man in your town whose job it is to watch you, and he has a special stick just for people who fall asleep in church. It's a powerful incentive to stay awake, and an even more powerful reminder that, in this city upon a hill, the eyes of your neighbors are always upon you. The days following that first Sunday settle into a grueling routine. governed by the sun and the ever-present fear of idleness. You learn quickly that here, work is a form of worship, and leisure is a sin. Your life is a constant battle against the wilderness, against hunger, and against the perceived weaknesses of your own soul. The concept of free time as you know it simply does not exist. Your day begins before the sun rises, with private prayer. Then, it's a race to get the fire going, prepare a simple, meager breakfast of cornmeal, mush or bread, and get to work. For men, this means heading to the fields to clear rocks and stumps, planting or harvesting, depending on the season. It might mean felling trees, building fences, or hunting. For women, the work is inside and around the home, but no less relentless. It involves cooking, baking, churning butter, spinning wool into thread, weaving that thread into cloth, sewing clothes, tending the vegetable garden, raising children, and preserving food for the long, brutal winter. Every moment of daylight is precious and must be filled with productive, purposeful activity. There is no going for a walk to clear your head. There is no sitting on the porch to enjoy the sunset. These actions would be seen as idleness or unprofitable strolling, and they were actual, documented offenses. In places like Plymouth Colony, laws were passed that specifically fined people for wandering about without a clear purpose. You discover this the hard way. One afternoon, having finished your assigned tasks for the moment, you find yourself with a rare, unclaimed half-hour before the evening meal. You decide to simply sit on the rough wooden bench outside your door. You're not doing anything, just watching the clouds drift by. A small moment of quiet contemplation. It lasts for all of 5 minutes before the tithing man, Mr. Hopkins, happens to walk by. He stops. "Good day," he says, his tone implying that the day is, in fact, not good. "Is there a task that requires your attention outdoors?" "No, Mr. Hopkins," you reply, feeling a prickle of defensive sweat. "I'm merely resting a moment." He cocks his head, his expression one of deep, spiritual concern. "The devil finds work for idle hands," he says, quoting a proverb that is as good as law here. "There is wool to be carded, you say not? Or perhaps a tool that needs mending. To be idle is to invite temptation." He doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't need to. The threat is implicit. He watches you for another long moment before continuing on his way. You immediately get up and go inside, grabbing a broom and sweeping the already clean dirt floor, just in case he glances back. The message is clear: even the appearance of doing nothing is a punishable sin. This obsession with constant labor leads to some fascinating and slightly bizarre societal quirks. One of these is the concept of neighborly work. If a family's barn burned down or a man was too sick to bring in his harvest, the community would come together for a raising or a bee. Men would work together to rebuild the structure, or women would gather to quilt or preserve food for the afflicted family. On the surface, it's a beautiful act of Christian charity, and it was, but it also served another purpose. It turned work into a social, observable event. It was a way for the community to collectively demonstrate its industriousness and piety. There was no room for shirkers at a barn raising. Your contribution, or lack thereof, was plain for all to see. This intense focus on productivity meant that anything seen as frivolous was treated with deep suspicion. Games, for instance, while children were allowed some simple, wholesome pastimes, games of chance like cards or dice were utterly forbidden. They were seen as tools of the devil, encouraging both idleness and the sin of covetousness. In 1647, the Massachusetts General Court passed a law explicitly banning not only cards and dice, but also shuffling and cutting, which presumably meant any game involving them. The penalty for being caught was a fine of 5 shillings, a significant amount of money that could buy a good deal of corn. The debate among historians on this point is subtle but important. Were the Puritans fundamentally opposed to all forms of fun and relaxation? Or were they simply opposed to activities that they believed actively harmed the soul and threatened the stability of their precarious society? Some scholars argue that the Puritans were not as universally grim as their reputation suggests. They drank beer, had loving families, and could appreciate moments of beauty. They weren't against pleasure itself, but against disordered pleasure that took precedence over one's duty to God and the community. Others argue that this is too generous a reading, and that the sheer volume of legislation against simple human pastimes points to a culture that was, at its core, deeply suspicious of joy. You find yourself caught in the middle of this debate, living its reality. One evening, through the thin wall at your cabin, you hear your neighbor's children laughing. It's a sound you haven't heard much. A moment later, you hear their father's stern voice. Hush now, the Lord's day is near. There is no time for such noise. The laughter cuts off abruptly. The silence that follows is more telling than the laughter ever was. You look at your own hands, calloused and sore from the day's labor. You are exhausted, but you know you can't stop. To stop is to be idle. To be idle is to be sinful. To be sinful is to be a threat to the entire community. So you pick up a piece of wool that needs to be carded, its rough fibers pulling at the skin on your fingers. You work until the last bit of light fades from the sky, and then you continue by the flickering, greasy light of a tallow candle, because even in the encroaching darkness, you cannot afford to be still. The town square, or the common, is the heart of your new world. It's where the militia drills, where cows sometimes graze, and where public announcements are made. It is also the stage for the community's theater of justice. And one sunny, crisp autumn afternoon, you get your first ticket to the show. You hear the sound of a drum, a slow, solemn beat. People begin to emerge from their homes and workshops, their faces a mixture of grim duty and morbid curiosity. You follow the small crowd as it gathers in the center of the common. There, standing next to the town magistrate, is a man you recognize, a young farmer named Thomas, known for being a bit too fond of his own voice. Yes, not in chains. Not yet, but his shoulders are slumped in defeat. In the center of the square stand two instruments that will become grimly familiar to you, the stocks and the pillory. They are both made of heavy wood, designed for public humiliation. The stocks are the low minus to minus the minus ground version, a wooden frame with holes for the ankles. The offender sits on a low bench, their feet locked in place, exposed to the elements and the scorn of their neighbors. The pillory is the standing version, a wooden framework on a post with holes for the head and hands. This was generally considered the more severe of the two, as it forced the offender to stand, often for hours, in a cramped, painful position. The magistrate unrolls a piece of parchment and reads the charges in a loud, clear voice. Thomas is accused of profane swearing and boisterous merriment on a public thoroughfare. Essentially, he told a loud, off-minus-colored joke in the hearing of several of his neighbors, including the ever-minus-vigilant Mr. Hopkins. There is no trial as you would understand it. The testimony of two witnesses is enough for a conviction. Thomas offers no defense. He just stares at the ground. His sentence is to be confined to the stocks for 3 hours. Two men lead him to the low bench. He sits, and they lift the heavy top plank, guide his ankles into the round holes, and slam it shut, securing it with a wooden peg. Then now, the show begins. For the next 3 hours, Thomas is public property. He is a living sermon, a cautionary tale for all to see. People don't just walk past and ignore him. They are encouraged to interact. Children, emboldened by their parents' stern approval, point and mock him. Some of the more pious women walk by, shaking their heads and muttering about the state of his soul. A group of young men, perhaps his friends on any other day, now stand at a distance, cheering. Someone throws a handful of mud that spatters against his leg. This was a common and accepted part of the punishment. Offenders in the stocks or pillory were pelted with all manner of things: mud, rotten vegetables, animal dung. It was a physical manifestation of the community's disapproval. You stand at the edge of the crowd, a knot of discomfort tightening in your stomach. It feels cruel, disproportionate. A stupid joke has earned him hours of physical discomfort and deep, lasting humiliation. But as you look at the faces of the town elders watching from the steps of the meetinghouse, you see no cruelty. You see righteous certainty. In their view, this isn't just about punishing Thomas. It's about cleansing the community. His sin, his public display of empathy, has polluted their city upon a hill. This public ritual of shaming is a way to purge that pollution and restore spiritual order. This brings you to a fascinatedly strange and specific type of public punishment, reserved for certain offenses, being forced to sit on a repentant stool in a meeting house. This wasn't a physical punishment in the same way as the stocks, but it was psychologically brutal, for crimes deemed more spiritual than civil, like skipping church, heresy, or publicly questioning the minister. An offender might be sentenced to sit on a small stool placed in the main aisle of the church, directly in front of the pulpit, for the duration of the Sunday service. They would have to endure the entire 3-hour sermon while the entire congregation stared at their back. Sometimes they were required to wear a sign detailing their crime. It was a powerful tool, combining religious authority with public shame. As you watch poor Thomas suffer in the stocks, you start to notice the subtleties of this system. The punishments are highly visible for a reason. There are no private prisons here. Justice is not a remote, abstract concept. It is a tangible, public performance. The goal is not just to punish the individual, but to educate and intimidate the entire populace. Every person who walks past the stocks gets a free, potent lesson in the consequences of stepping out of line. And this raises a question that historians and sociologists still grapple with. Does public shaming actually work as a deterrent? On one hand, the fear of being placed in the stocks was undoubtedly a powerful motivator for good behavior. The desire to avoid that level of humiliation would keep most people on the straight and narrow. On the other hand, does it breed resentment? Does it create a society based on fear rather than genuine moral conviction? Some historians argue that the constant threat of public shame fostered a culture of hypocrisy, where people became experts at maintaining an outward appearance of piety while hiding their true feelings. Others maintain that, in the context of a fragile community fighting for survival, these harsh measures were seen as a necessary tool for maintaining the social cohesion upon which every honest life depended. The sun begins to dip lower, and the 3 hours are finally up. The magistrate returns, the peg is removed, and the top plank is lifted. Thomas stumbles to his feet, his ankles red and raw. He doesn't look at anyone. He keeps his head down, his face a mask of shame, and shuffles away towards his home as quickly as his stiff legs will carry him. The crowd disperses. The show is over, but the image of him, locked in that wooden frame, is burned into your memory. You now understand that the laws here are not just written in books. They are written in wooden iron, and they are displayed in the center of town for all to see. And you make a silent vow to yourself. You will do whatever it takes to never be the main attraction. Your vow to remain invisible is tested sooner than you expect, and over something you would never have anticipated: your clothes. One morning, as you're preparing for the day, you pull out a small wooden chest that contains the few possessions you brought from England. At the bottom, wrapped in a piece of linen, is a small personal indulgence, a set of cuffs, finely made, with a subtle but elegant line of lace trim. They belong to your mother. You haven't worn them, but just seeing them brings a small, sharp pang of comfort, a connection to the life you left behind. On a whim, feeling a desperate need for a tiny piece of your old self, you decide to sew them onto the sleeves of your drab, homespun woolen dress. They are discreet, barely noticeable unless someone looks closely. You tell yourself it's a harmless act of remembrance. This is a profound miscalculation. You go about your morning chores, visiting the well, tending your small garden. You notice a few of the other women giving you longer than usual glances, their eyes flickering down to your wrists. You don't think much of it until your neighbor, Goodwife Miller, appears at your door, her face a mask of grave concern. "I word with you, sister," she says, her voice low. She steps inside, her eyes immediately fixing on the lace. "That fine apparel, too fine, perhaps, for our humble station here. It was my mother's," you say defensively. "It is only a small thing." "Small things can cast long shadows," she replies, her voice softening into a tone of practiced piety that sets your teeth on edge. Pride is a sin that creeps into the soul through such small openings. The magistrates have spoken on the matter of excess in dress. It is a sign of a worldly heart, a heart turned from God. She is not just giving friendly advice. She is referencing a very real and very serious aspect of Puritan laws and PTU laws. These were regulations designed to curb extravagance and enforce social hierarchies through clothing. The leaders of the Massachusetts Bay Colony were deeply troubled by what they saw as a growing trend of people dressing above their station. In their eyes, a farmer's wife wearing silk was not just a fashion choice. It was an act of social insubordination, a dangerous blurring of the God-minus ordained lines that held their society together. So, in 1651, the Massachusetts General Court enacted a famous PTU law that explicitly targeted people of mean condition. The law stated that anyone whose personal wealth was less than £200 was forbidden from wearing gold or silver lace, buttons, or any garment made of silk. If you were caught violating this law, you faced a hefty fine. Essentially, they put a price tag on fashion. If you were rich, you could wear fancy clothes as a sign of your God-minus given prosperity. If you were poor, you had to dress the part. Goodwife Miller's warning is, in fact, a threat. She is letting you know that she has noticed your transgression. If you continue to wear the lace, she, or someone else, will feel it is their Christian duty to report you to the tithing man or the magistrate. You would be forced to publicly account for your prideful apparel. Defeated and humiliated, you go back inside, carefully unpick the stitches, and put the lace cuffs back in the chest, burying them under a pile of rough linen. The small joy they gave you has curdled into fear. You now see your own clothing not as a matter of personal taste, but as a public statement, a uniform of conformity. This obsession with rooting out vanity leads to some truly bizarre and specific prohibitions. For instance, there was a great deal of suspicion around the craft of wig-minus making. While some older men or those who had lost their hair to disease were permitted to wear simple, unadorned wigs, the elaborate, powdered wigs, popular in England and Europe, were seen as the absolute pinnacle of sinful vanity. Ministers would preach fiery sermons against the abomination of false hair. Similarly, the length of a man's hair was a subject of serious debate. Long hair on men was considered effeminate and disorderly. In 1649, Governor John Endicott and other magistrates signed a proclamation against the cutting, curling and immodest laying out of their hair by the colony's men. They saw it as a sign of moral decay creeping into their godly society. The historical debate here is fascinating. Were these laws purely about enforcing a rigid, religious-based austerity, or were they also a pragmatic tool for economic control? Some historians argue that by discouraging the purchase of expensive imported fabrics like silk and lace, the Puritan leaders were trying to prevent capital from flowing out of their cash-strapped colony. They wanted people to invest their money in productive things, like land and livestock, not in frivolous clothing. So, the laws served a dual purpose. They kept souls humble and kept the local economy stable. Other scholars argue this gives the Puritans too much credit for economic foresight, and that the driving force was, first and foremost, a theological terror of pride and worldliness. That afternoon, you see a woman you don't know well being escorted from her home by the constable. Her neighbors are gathered outside, whispering. You ask someone what has happened. The answer: she was found to have added a colorful silk ribbon to her cap. A ribbon, a simple, small piece of colored fabric, is enough to warrant a formal sanction. You return to your home and look at your drab, colorless clothes. You think of the delicate lace hidden in your chest. It was a tiny, harmless link to your past, to your mother, to a world that had softness and beauty in it. But here, in this city upon a hill, it is evidence of a crime. You realize with a sinking heart that they are not just trying to control what you do or what you say. They are trying to control what you love. After a long week of hard labor and enforced piety, the desire for a small release, a moment of fellowship that isn't steeped in solemn prayer, becomes a powerful craving. You learn that, contrary to the grim stereotypes, the Puritans were not teetotalers. They did not forbid the consumption of alcohol. In fact, they saw it as a gift from God, a good creature of God to be used in moderation. The key word, you will discover, is moderation. Your introduction to this complex relationship with alcohol comes through the tavern. The tavern, or ordinary as it was often called, was a licensed and regulated institution in most Puritan towns. It served as an inn for travelers, a place for men to conduct business, and a hub for community news. It was one of the few places where you could legally gather and socialize outside of the meeting house. One evening, emboldened by a rare coin in your pocket, you decide to visit the local ordinary. Pushing open the door, you are met with a wave of warmth and a low hum of conversation that is startlingly different from the hushed tones of the street. The room is dimly lit by a large fire and a few tallow candles. Men are gathered around rough-hewn tables, nursing mugs of beer or cider. The air smells of wood smoke, wet wool, and stale ale. You find a spot in a corner and order a tankard of small beer ale, low-alcohol beverage that was a staple of the daily diet for everyone, including children, because it was often safer to drink than the local water. As you sip the watery, slightly sour brew, you listen. The conversations are not about theology. They are about the price of corn, the threat of raids from local tribes, a dispute over a property line. It's the mundane, practical talk of survival. For a moment, it feels almost normal. But the hand of Puritan regulation is ever present. Even here, behind the bar, nailed to the wall, is a list of town ordinances regarding the conduct of patrons. You see a rule stating that no patron is allowed to drink for more than half an hour at a time. Another forbids the singing of lewd or ungodly songs. A third, and most important, makes it a serious crime to sell alcohol to anyone who is already in drink. The tavern keeper is not just a businessman. He is a deputized moral guardian, responsible for the sobriety of his customers. If a man leaves his tavern drunk, the keeper can be fined as heavily as the drunkard himself. You watch as a man at a nearby table, his face flushed, laughs a little too loudly and calls for another drink. The tavern keeper comes over, takes the man's empty mug, and shakes his head. You've had your portion for the evening. Goodman Finch, he says, his voice quiet but firm. The Lord would have you home with your family now. The man grumbles but doesn't argue. He knows the rules. He gets up and leaves. The punishment for public drunkenness was swift, public, and imaginative. A first offense might get you a fine, but repeat offenders face the classic punishments of the stocks or the pillory. And for chronic drunkards, some towns devised a special form of humiliation. They were forced to wear a letter. While the scarlet A for adultery is the most famous, it was not the only letter in the Puritan alphabet of shame. For drunkenness, their letter was a law, red D, which had to be sewn on to the offender's outer garments. They would have to wear the sign of their sin every day, a walking advertisement of their weakness. This leads you to one of the most peculiar and frankly bizarre temperance laws enacted in the colonies. In some areas, to curb what they saw as the wasteful and sinful habit of drinking health or toasting, the courts simply banned the practice altogether. The 1639 records of the Massachusetts Bay Colony note an order for abolishing the vain custom of drinking to one another. They reasoned that toasting encouraged people to drink more than they otherwise would, leading to excess and drunkenness. So the simple act of raising your mug and saying to your health could land you in front of a magistrate. It's a level of micromanagement that is truly staggering. As you sit in the tavern, nursing your single drink, you think about this paradox. They embraced alcohol as a divine gift, but were terrified of its power. Why? Historians offer a few explanations. First, on a practical level, a drunk colonist was a useless and dangerous colonist. In a settlement where every able-bodied person was needed for labor and defense, someone incapacitated by drink was a liability. Drunkenness led to fights, accidents, and neglect of duties, all of which the fragile community could ill afford. But the deeper fear was theological. Drunkenness was a loss of control, and for the Puritans, self-managed control was the hallmark of the elect, the chosen saints of God. To lose control of your senses, to give in to the fleshly indulgence of intoxication, was to demonstrate that you were likely one of the damned. It was an outward sign of inner corruption. So the question of whether a man was just tipsy or truly drunk was not a matter for a breathalyzer. It was a matter for soul-minus searching and public judgment. The line was blurry and, as with so many things here, subject to the interpretation of your neighbors. You finish your beer. The half-minus hour you are allotted is nearly up anyway. You pay your penny and step out into the cold night air. The brief feeling of warmth and community inside the tavern vanishes, replaced by the familiar chill of watchfulness. You walk home, your steps measured and sober. You now understand that even here, in the one place that offered a shadow of ordinary life, the rules are always present. You can have a drink, but you must not enjoy it too much. It is a gift from God, but a gift He is watching you use, and He is not known for His generosity with second chances. The unspoken rules, the disapproving glances, the public corrections for minor sins like idleness or lace, all of these are the daily hum of Puritan life. They are unsettling, but you learn to navigate them. Then, one day, the hum crescendos into a roar. You see true, soul minus crushing, life minus altering shame, and it comes in the form of a single, bright, red letter. You see her for the first time near the town pump. Her name is Esther, a name you learn only in whispers. She is walking alone, which is unusual for a woman, but it's not her solitude that makes everyone stop and stare. It's the piece of fabric sewn onto the breast of her dress. It's a letter A, meticulously crafted from scarlet cloth and embroidered with gold thread. It's ornate, almost beautiful in its artistry, which makes its message all the more shocking. Even as a newcomer, you know what it stands for: adultery. The scarlet letter was a real punishment, immortalized by Nathaniel Hawthorne but practiced in the colonies long before he wrote his famous novel. It was the ultimate symbol of public humiliation, a sentence that didn't end after a few hours in the pillory. It was a lifelong burden, a constant, visible reminder of sin, worn every single day, from the moment you dressed in the morning to the moment you undressed at night. As Hester walks towards the pump, a space of silence forms around her. The women who were chatting fall quiet. They pull their children closer, as if her sin were a contagious disease. Men avert their eyes, not out of respect for her privacy, but as a public performance of their own piety. No one speaks to her. No one helps her. She is an island of shame in the middle of the community. She fills her bucket and walks away, her back straight, her face a pale, unreadable mess. You watch her go, and a cold dread washes over you. You think about the crime itself. Adultery was not just a moral failing. It was a capital crime in the early Massachusetts Bay Colony, punishable by death according to their legal code, which was drawn directly from the Old Testament. While the death penalty was rarely enforced for this crime, the fact that it was on the books shows how seriously they took it. It was a threat not just to a single marriage, but to the entire patriarchal, property-minus-based foundation of their society. It undermined the orderly transfer of land and inheritance, and it defied the sanctity of the family, which they saw as the cornerstone of their city upon a hill. Later, you learn more of her story from the hush, judgmental gossip of your neighbors. Her husband was presumed lost at sea. She had a child. The father of the child remains a secret, a mystery that gnaws at the town's collective conscience. For her refusal to name him, her punishment was arguably made harsher in its daily endurance. She was not put to death, but sentenced to this living social death instead. This leads you to a fascinating, if grim, little detail of Puritan law: the probable and presumable evidence standard. In a case like this, the birth of a child to a woman whose husband was absent was considered presumable evidence of adultery. They didn't need a witness to the act itself. The evidence was in the woman's very body. The standard of evidence was common in cases of fornication and adultery, and it placed an enormous burden of proof on women. But the most compelling and historically debated aspect of this punishment is its psychological effect. What was it like to actually wear the letter? Did it, as the magistrates intended, lead to true repentance and a humble heart? Did it break the spirit of the wearer, turning them into a hollow shell of a person? Or could it, paradoxically, become a source of defiant strength? This is the core of Hawthorne's novel and the subject of much speculation by historians. Some accounts suggest that individuals forced to wear letters of shame were completely ostracized, unable to find work or even buy food. Driven to the absolute margins of society, they were pariahs in every sense of the word. However, other interpretations, both fictional and historical, suggest a more complex reality. Could a person, over time, begin to redefine the meaning of their punishment? Could Hester's intricate embroidery of the letter be seen not as pride, but as an act of defiance, a way of owning her sentence and refusing to be utterly destroyed by it? Historians still argue whether the primary outcome of such shaming was submission or a subtle, hardened resistance. You see Hester again a few days later, sitting on the steps of the meetinghouse. So, it's her trade, her only means of survival. The same women who shun her at the pump will secretly commission her for her beautiful needlework. They want her skill, but not her company. It's a strange, hypocritical relationship that allows her to survive, but only just. Watching her, you realize the true genius and cruelty of this punishment. It doesn't just punish the offender, it weaponizes the entire community. Every person in the town becomes a willing or unwilling participant in her daily humiliation. Every averted gaze, every whispered comment, every child pulled away from her path, they are all tiny, individual blows that reinforce her sentence. The letter itself is just a piece of cloth. The real punishment is delivered by the eyes of her neighbors. You turn away, feeling a profound sense of unease. You came here for a new life in a godly society. But standing here, you feel you are living in a fishbowl. And some of the fish are marked for reasons you are only just beginning to understand. The scarlet letter is not just a warning against a specific sin. It's a warning against any secret, any deviation, any part of your life that does not conform to the rigid, unblinking gaze of the community. Then you wonder, with a shiver, how many other letters are in the alphabet of shame. You had assumed that the most severe public shaming, the wearing of letters, was reserved for the gravest of sins: adultery, drunkenness, blasphemy. It is a shock. Then, when you see a man named Silas, a quiet bachelor who keeps to himself, emerge from the magistrate's home with a new, unwelcome addition to his coat. It is a large, stalk letter I, sewn onto his sleeve. You ask your neighbor, good wife Miller, what crime this letter signifies. You run through the possibilities in your head. Empathy, incitement. What has he done? You whisper. She presses her lips into a thin line. He is an idol, she says with a sniff. But worse, he has been writing. Writing? You ask, confused. Is that a crime? It is, when the writing is vain and serves no purpose but to stir the passions. She explains, he has been writing. Poetry, not songs, mind you, verses of his own making, rhymes about the moon, and now you tell, even about a woman in a neighboring town. This is a stunning revelation. In your old life, a man writing a clumsy love poem might be the subject of gentle teasing. Here, it is a crime worthy of public branding. You learn the full story in bits and pieces. Silas was not a farmer. He was a thinker, a reader, and, in his spare time, a scribbler. He was not fulfilling his calling with sufficient vigor. His neighbors saw him reading or writing when he could have been mending a fence or chopping wood. This was the idleness part of his crime. The poetry was the proof of his corrupted, unproductive mind. The court deemed his verses unprofitable and foolish, a waste of God-minus given time and a potential source of moral disruption. The letter I he was forced to wear could stand for several things, depending on the specific judgment of the court. Most commonly, it stood for idleness, a cardinal sin in this industrious society. But in a case like this, it could also imply incendiary or inflammatory, as his words were seen as a potential spark for impure thoughts in others. He was, in effect, being punished for having a hobby. This is not a fictional embellishment. The case of Captain Campbell of Boston is a famous example. He was sentenced to the stocks for his lewd and unseemly behavior, which consisted of kissing his wife publicly on their doorstep on a Sunday, after returning from a 3- CSC voyage. A more obscure but telling case is that of a man named Philip Radcliffe. In 1631, he was severely punished for, among other things, making scandalous and unseemly speeches against the government and the church. While not exactly poetry, it shows the extreme sensitivity to any form of unauthorized or critical expression. The idea of a man being punished for writing bad poetry fits perfectly within this mindset. Any writing that wasn't a sermon, a legal document, or in direct praise of God was deeply suspect. This brings you to a strange and little minus known aspect of early colonial life, the active suppression of creative expression. There were no theaters. The first one wouldn't be built in Boston for another 100 years, and even then, it would face massive opposition. Plays were seen as dens of lies and moral corruption. Fictional stories were similarly frowned upon. Why would a godly person waste their time reading something that wasn't true? The historical debate around this is nuanced. Was it total cultural waste then? Not exactly. The Puritans produced a huge amount of written material, sermons, theological treatises, diaries, and histories. They valued literacy highly, because every man and woman needed to be able to read the Bible for themselves. But their definition of valuable literature was incredibly narrow. It had to be didactic. It had to serve a purpose. It had to instruct, edify, or glorify God. Art for art's sake was a dangerous, foreign concept. Yet, paradoxically, some of the most enduring poetry of the era came from a Puritan woman. Anne Bradstreet, she wrote beautiful, personal poems about her family, her home, her faith, and her doubts, but she did so carefully. Her first book of poetry, published in London, was released with an introduction by her brother in law that essentially apologized for her being a female writer, assuring readers that she hadn't neglected her domestic duties to write. Her work was framed as acceptable because it ultimately reinforced, rather than challenged, Puritan values of family and faith. Silas, with his foolish rhymes about the moon, had no such defense. His art served no one but his own idle fancy. You see Silas in the days that follow. The letter I on his sleeve seems to drain the life from him. He avoids eye contact with everyone. He no longer sits and reads. You see him in the woods, clumsily chopping at a tree, his movements awkward and inefficient. He is performing the role of the industrious man, but his heart isn't in it. The punishment wasn't just about shaming him. It was about crushing the part of him that was different, the part that didn't fit into their rigid mold of productivity. You think about the nature of his crime. He didn't harm anyone. He didn't steal. He didn't blaspheme in public. He simply arranged words in a way that pleased him, and for that, he was branded. It makes you realize that the leaders of this community weren't just afraid of sin. They were afraid of the human imagination. An imagination left to its own devices might question authority. It might dream of other ways to live. It might, in the quiet of the night, find more beauty in the moon than in a 3-hour sermon on predestination. The letter I is not as dramatic as the Scarlet A, but, in some ways, it feels more chilling. The A punishes a universal human failing. The I punishes a specific human gift. It's a clear message to everyone: your thoughts are not your own. Your creativity is not your own. Your time is not your own. It all belongs to the community, to be used for its purposes, not yours. And any attempt to claim a small piece of it for yourself, for something as frivolous as a poem, will be seen, judged, and stamped out. The appearance of the letter I on Silas's coat opens your eyes to a whole new vocabulary of shame. You start to pay closer attention, morbidly curious about this public alphabet. You learn that the Scarlet A for adultery, the Red D for drunkenness, and the Stark I for idleness are just the most common characters in a small but potent lexicon of punishment. Over the next few months, you witness the quiet debut of other letters. You see a man forced to wear a B on his sleeve for a week. You learn his crime was blasphemy. He had apparently cursed God in the moment of frustration after his ox cart got stuck in the mud. The people overheard him, and that was enough. The punishment for a first offense was relatively light: a few hours in the pillory and the wearing of the letter. A second offense, you hear whispered, could result in branding, whipping, or even banishment. Then, you see a young servant girl, barely 16, with a T sewn onto her apron. The letter stands for thief. Her crime? She had stolen a small meat pie from her master's pantry. In a community where food is scarce and survival depends on the careful rationing of resources, theft was considered a serious betrayal of trust. She is not just a thief. She is a threat to the stability of the household, and, by extension, the entire town. Her public marking serves as a stark warning to all other servants and apprentices. This practice of using letters was not uniform across all of New England. It was a legal tool that different colonies and towns adopted and adapted as they saw fit. The 1696 Massachusetts law, for example, codified the scarlet A, but other letters were often a matter of local custom and judicial discretion. This is what makes it so fascinating to historians. It wasn't a centralized, top-down system. It was a grassroots form of social control, with each community creating its own symbols of sin. The use of these letters raises a compelling question: why letters? Why not just put everyone in the stocks? The answer lies in the Puritan obsession with symbolism and literacy. They were a people of the book. The written word held immense power. For them, sin was not just a bad action. It was a form of spiritual illiteracy, a failure to read and obey God's law. By branding a sinner with a letter, they were literally making the sin legible. The offender became a walking text, a sermon on deviance that everyone in the community could read at a glance. It turned the human body into a public notice board for moral instruction. This leads you to discover some of the more obscure and specialized forms of this punishment. In some jurisdictions, instead of a letter, a person might be forced to wear a rope around their neck, known as a halter, as a sign that their crime, like attacking a parent, was worthy of the gallows. Even if mercy had been shown, a more vividly symbolic punishment was reserved for arsonists. In the colony of New Haven, an arsonist was not only executed but might first be forced to wear a representation of a flame on their clothing. The symbol directly mirrored the crime. The debate among legal historians on this topic is lively. Was this system of marking and shaming an effective form of early criminal justice, or was it simply a form of ritualized cruelty? Proponents of the first view argue that, in a society without a professional police foresaw a large prison system, these public, symbolic punishments were a pragmatic and relatively low-cost way to maintain order. They were designed to reintegrate the offender back into the community after a period of penance, rather than locking them away permanently. The shame was the medicine, however bitter. Critics, however, argue that these punishments were psychologically devastating and often counterproductive. By permanently marking someone, you made it almost impossible for them to ever truly escape their past. A person wearing a T would find it incredibly difficult to find new employment. A woman wearing an A was a social outcast for life. Instead of reintegration, the punishment often led to permanent marginalization, forcing people to the fringes of society or even driving them out of the colony altogether. You see this firsthand with the girl who wore the T. After her week of public shaming is over, she is allowed to remove the letter. But it doesn't matter. The letter is gone from her apron, but it is seared into the memory of the town. Her master dismisses her. No other family will take her in. She is seen as untrustworthy. Her character permanently stained. A few weeks later, she is gone, having left the town in the middle of the night, presumably to try and find a new life in a place where no one knows her story. Her punishment didn't cure her or reintegrate her. It expelled her. You start to see the town not as a single, unified body, but as a collection of individuals, each with their own invisible letters. You have your hidden lace scuffs. Silas has his silent poems. Hester has her secret lover. The man who wore the B has his private frustrations. The girl who wore the T was, perhaps, just hungry. The public letters are only the ones that have been discovered. The community is held together not just by shared faith, but by a shared fear of exposure. The alphabet of shame is small, but its power is immense. It's a simple, brutal technology of control. It takes a complex human being with a lifetime of experiences and motivations, and reduces them to a single, damning character. A, D, D, I, B, T. It's a language everyone here understands, and it's a language you are becoming fluent in, not by choice, but by necessity. You learn to read the signs, both visible and invisible, and you learn, above all, to keep your own page blank. The punishment you've witnessed so far, the stocks, the letters, the public condemnations are all designed to inflict psychological and social pain. They are forms of humiliation. But one afternoon, by the river that runs along the edge of town, you witness a punishment that is startlingly physical, visceral, and aimed almost exclusively at women. You see King Minus Stool, or as it was more commonly known, the Dunking Stool. The accused is a woman named Goodwife Powell. She's not a sinner in the same vein as Hester or the man who blasphemed. Her crime is being a common scold. In the eyes of the Puritan patriarchy, this was a serious offense. A scold was a woman who was argumentative, gossipy, or who dared to publicly challenge the authority of her husband or the town elders. She was a woman who talked too much and whose speech was deemed disruptive to the peace and order of the community. The instrument of her punishment is a bizarre-looking contraption. It's a long, heavy wooden beam balanced on a fulcrum on the riverbank, like a giant seesaw. A simple wooden chair is attached to one end. This is the Dunking Stool. Is a tool designed to use public humiliation and the shock of cold water to cool the hot tongues of troublesome women. A small crowd has gathered to watch. There's a nervous, almost giddy energy that is different from the solemnity of the punishments on the common. Goodwife Powell, her face a mixture of terror and defiance, is forcibly strapped into the chair. The constable and a few other men take their places at the other end of the beam. The magistrate reads the verdict, declaring her disturber of the peace. Then, here goes the signal. The men on the bank push down on their end of the beam. The other end, with Goodwife Powell strapped to it, swings out over the river and then plunges down into the icy water. She disappears completely for a few seconds that stretch into an eternity. Then, they heave her back up. She emerges sputtering, gasping for air, her clothes soaked and clinging to her, her hair plastered to her face. She is given a moment to catch her breath, to feel the jeers and laughter of some in the crowd, before they dunk her again and again. The number of dunks was specified in the sentence, usually 3. It is a brutal, terrifying, and deeply humiliating spectacle. It is a punishment that is part physical assault, part street theatre. The use of the Dunking Stool was an Old English punishment that the colonists brought with them. It was almost exclusively used on women, which speaks volumes about the Puritan anxiety surrounding female speech. A man who was loud and argumentative might be seen as authoritative or passionate. A woman who did the same was a threat to the natural order. Her voice was meant to be quiet, her opinions subservient. The Dunking Stool was a tool for enforcing that silence. As you watch, shivering in sympathy, you learn about an even more obscure and specific application of this punishment. In some English towns, from which these Puritan practices derived, the Dunking Stool was also used on brewers who made bad ale or bakers who sold underweight loaves of bread. Both men and women could be subjected to it for these commercial crimes. However, in New England, its use became almost entirely focused on punishing women for verbal transgressions. This narrowing of focus from commercial fraud to female speech is a detail that fascinates social historians. It shows how the colonists adapted old-world traditions to fit their specific anxieties about gender roles and social control in their new, fragile society. The historical debate around the scold is rich and complex. Were these women truly disruptive shrews who made life miserable for their neighbors? Or were they simply women who were outspoken, intelligent, and unwilling to conform to the narrow box of Puritan womanhood? It's impossible to know for sure, as all the court records were written by the men who were judging them. There are no surviving accounts from the perspective of the scolds themselves. Some feminist historians argue that the charge of being a scold was often a convenient way to silence women who were inconvenient women who challenged business dealings, who spoke up about abuse, or who simply had a more forceful personality than their male counterparts were comfortable with. It was a weapon to police the boundaries of acceptable female behavior. Others argue that, in a small, close-knit community where gossip and slander could ruin reputations and tear the social fabric, there was a genuine belief that disorderly speech was a real danger that needed to be controlled, and women were seen as the primary culprits. After the third dunking, Goodwife Powell is unstrapped from the chair. She is shivering violently, soaked to the bone, and utterly broken. The defiance is gone from her face, replaced by a vacant, hollow look of shock and shame. Her husband leads her away, and the crowd disperses, their appetite for spectacle satisfied for the day. You walk home, the image of her gasping, waterlogged face burned into your mind. The stocks humiliate, the letters brand, but the dunking stool feels different. It is a physical violation, an act of ritualized drowning designed to terrorize a woman into silence. It sends a clear message to you and every other woman in the village. Your words have weight, but if you use them in a way the men in power disapprove of, they will use the weight of the river to crush you. It's a lesson in the physics of power, and you learn it without ever getting wet. The dunking stool was a public spectacle, a loud and wet form of punishment, but you soon learn of another instrument, one that was arguably more terrifying in its quiet, personal cruelty. It was a punishment that didn't just aim to silence a woman's voice in public, it aimed to physically lock it away. You hear it spoken of in hushed, fearful tones, the brink, or as it was more vividly known, the scold's bridle or gossip's bridle. You don't see one in your own town, for which you are deeply grateful. The brank was less common in New England than it was in England and Scotland, but the colonists knew of it, and the threat of its use was a powerful tool. You learn about it from a traveler passing through, a merchant who has seen one used in another settlement. His description paints a chilling picture. The brank was a heavy iron helmet or cage that was locked onto the offender's head. It had a metal frame that enclosed the entire skull, but the most diabolical part was the bridle bait, a small, fat plate of iron, sometimes sharpened or covered in spikes, that was inserted into the woman's mouth and pressed down on top of her tongue. Once the cage was locked, it was impossible for her to speak. Any attempt to move her tongue would cause excruciating pain. The merchant described seeing a woman punished with this device. She was accused of slander, of spreading malicious rumors about the minister. She wasn't dunked or put in the stocks. Instead, the constable locked the brank onto her head. Then, she was led by a leash attached to the helmet and paraded through the center of town. She was forced to walk past the homes of her neighbors, the scene of her alleged gossip, unable to speak, her face caged in a mask of iron, saliva and tears running down her chin. The silence of the punishment was its most profound feature. It was a complete and total physical subjugation of her ability to communicate. This instrument of torture, for it can only be called that, has a strange and dark history. One of the most bizarre and little minus known facts about the scold's bridle is its supposed origin. According to some historical folklore, which may or may not be true, the device was first invented as a way to control disobedient horses and was later adapted for use on women. The symbolism is as potent as it is horrifying. It explicitly frames the outspoken woman as a beast of burden, an animal to be tamed and broken. The very design of the punishment was meant to dehumanize her. The historical debate around the brank is less about its purpose, which was clearly to silence and humiliate, and more about its prevalence and symbolic meaning. Some historians argue that its actual use in the American colonies was extremely rare, and it functioned more as a bogeyman, a threat whispered from husband to wife, a dark fairy tale to keep women in their place. Its power was in its reputation, not its application. Other scholars contend that even if it was used infrequently, its existence in the collective consciousness of the Puritans is profoundly revealing. It represents the most extreme manifestation of their fear of female speech. While a man's words could be sinful, a woman's words were seen as having a unique potential for chaos. They associated female gossip with the serpent in the Garden of Eden, a seductive, deceptive force that could lead the entire community into sin. The brank, therefore, wasn't just a punishment for slander. It was a tool for fighting a theological war against what they perceived as a fundamental, gendered threat. You try to imagine it. You try to imagine the cold weight of the iron on your head, the foul taste of the metal gag in your mouth, the searing pain if you dared to even swallow. You think of Goodwife Powell, who was dunked in the river. Her punishment was terrifying, but it was over in a few minutes. The woman in the bank had to endure her silent torment for hours, every second a fresh agony, every step a new humiliation. The merchant finishes his story, shaking his head. "I fear something to say," he mutters, makes a man glad for a quiet wife. The men around him nod in grim agreement. That night, you lie in your bed, the silence of your small house feeling different. It's no longer just the absence of sound. It feels like a presence, a heavy blanket of enforced quiet. You think about all the ways a person can be silenced. There's the disapproval of a neighbor. There's the fear of the tithing man's pole. There's the public shame of the stocks in the dunking stool. And then there is the brain. It represents the final step in a logic of control that begins with a disapproving glance. It's a logic that says a person's thoughts, words, and very identity are subject to the community's approval. The blank is the brutal, iron-clad conclusion to that logic. It is the physical manifestation of the idea that if your voice does not conform, it will be taken from you. You pull your rough blanket up to your chin, and for the first time, you are truly afraid of the silence. You've seen the tithing man's pole in action. You've heard the stories of fines, and you understand that nodding off during the sermon is a serious taboo, but you haven't yet grasped the full, bureaucratic, and almost obsessive extent to which the sin of sleeping in church was prosecuted. It wasn't just about a quick rap on the head and a moment of shame. For some, the consequences were far more formal and lasting. One Sunday, a man named Jonathan, a cooper by trade, falls into a deep, unshakable sleep during the minister's sermon. H.E.S., a hard worker, known for staying up late to finish orders, and the combination of exhaustion, the cold air, and the minister's droning voice proves to be his undoing. The tithing man's poke rouses him, but he drifts off again, and again. By the end of the service, his repeated offense has been noted by several people, including the town constable. This is not something that can be overlooked. The following week, Jonathan is formally summoned to appear before the local magistrate. His crime is not listed as napping, but with the more severe minor-sounding charge of profaning the Lord's Day by indecent behavior in the meetinghouse. It's a public record. You witness the proceedings, which are held in the magistrate's hall. There is no jury, no lawyer. Jonathan stands before the magistrate, a stern, grey-bearded man who also serves as an elder in the church. The tithing man and another man who sat near Jonathan give their testimony. They describe his unseemly slumber and how his head lolled in a manner distracting to the worship of others. Jonathan, a man who is strong and capable in his workshop, is now small and humble. He apologizes, explaining his exhaustion from his work. This is not a valid excuse. In the Puritan mindset, preparing oneself for the Sabbath was a duty. This included getting enough rest on Saturday night so that you would be physically and mentally allowed for a full day of worship. His exhaustion is seen not as a mitigating factor, but as a sign of poor spiritual planning. His sentence is a fine of 2 shillings. It's not a ruinous amount, but it's enough to sting. It's the price of a few dozen eggs or a good quantity of grain. But the real punishment is the public record. His name is now officially inscribed in the town's court documents as a Sabbath breaker. It's a stain on his reputation that will follow him. He is now the man who was fined for sleeping in church. This formal prosecution of sleeping was incredibly common. The court records of colonies like Massachusetts and Connecticut are filled with such cases. In 1646, the records of Plymouth Colony show a man named John Smith was fined 10 shillings, a very large sum for disorderly sleeping on the Lord's Day. The records don't specify the details, but the size of the fine suggests it must have been a particularly egregious or repeated offense. This leads to a fascinating and slightly absurd question: what constituted a legally punishable nap? This is where a very strange piece of puritanical legalism comes in. There was an informal but understood distinction between light slumber and deep sleep. A momentary head-nod, a brief closing of the eyes. This was the domain of the tithing man's pole. But a deep, audible sleep, especially if it involved snoring, was considered a more serious offense. Snoring was seen as a particularly disruptive and disrespectful act, a profane noise that actively interfered with the congregation's ability to hear the word of God. A man could literally be fined for snoring too loudly in church. The historical debate here centers on the motivation behind this zealous prosecution. Was it truly about ensuring every soul was attentive to the sermon for their own salvation? Or was it more about maintaining absolute authority and order? Some historians argue that the act of sleeping was seen as a form of passive rebellion. In a place where you were compelled to attend church, you could not refuse to go, but by falling asleep, you were, in a sense, mentally absenting yourself. You were present in body, but not in spirit. This was an affront to the minister's authority and the collective piety of the community. Punishing sleepers was a way to enforce not just physical attendance, but mental and spiritual participation. Other scholars suggest a more pragmatic reason. The meeting house was the center of all town communication. Important announcements, new laws, upcoming militia drills, warnings about attacks were often made from the pulpit after the sermon. A person sleeping through the service might miss vital information that affected the safety and security of the entire community. Therefore, ensuring everyone was awake was a matter of civic necessity as much as spiritual duty. You see Jonathan later in the week, outside his workshop. He looks weary, but now it's a different kind of weariness. It's the weight of public judgment. He sees you looking and gives a short, bitter nod. He knows what you're thinking. He knows what everyone is thinking. The incident makes you hyper-aware of your own behavior in the meeting house the following Sunday. You pinch yourself. You dig your fingernails into the wood of the bench. You count the knots in the ceiling beams, anything to keep your mind active and your eyes open. The minister's voice seems to drone on for an eternity, a river of theology that threatens to pull you under. You realize that rest is the most dangerous thing in this place. The one day of the week that is supposed to be for rest, the Sabbath, is the day you have to be the most vigilant. The one place you are supposed to find spiritual comfort, the meeting house, is the place that holds the most potential for public shame. The simple, universal, human need for sleep has been turned into a crime, complete with laws, witnesses, and fines. It's a perfect encapsulation of the Puritan paradox, a society obsessed with the state of the soul that spends an inordinate amount of time legislating the state of the body. As the year cycles towards its end, the days grow shorter and the air becomes bitingly cold. In the world you came from, this time of year would be filled with a growing sense of anticipation, of feasting on festivity. You find yourself unconsciously humming a half-remembered Christmas carol, a simple tune of joy and goodwill. You stop abruptly, a chill running down your spine that has nothing to do with the weather. You have just committed a thought-crime. You learn, to your utter astonishment, that in this city upon a hill, the celebration of Christmas is not just frowned upon, it is illegal. The revelation comes during a conversation with Goodwife Miller. You make an innocent remark about the approaching Yuletide season. Her reaction is one of genuine horror. "We do not observe such popish foolery here," she says, her voice sharp. "That is a pagan rite, a feast of gluttony and sin disguised in Christian robes. The 25th of December is to be a day of work, like any other. To treat it as a holy day is an offense against God in this colony." She is not exaggerating. In 1659, the General Court of the Massachusetts Bay Colony passed a now-infamous law that explicitly banned the celebration of Christmas. The law stated that whosoever shall be found observing any such day as Christmas or the like, either by forbearing of labor, feasting, or any other way, would be subject to a fine of 5 shillings for each offense. This law remained on the books for over 2 decades. This is a core tenet of the Puritan worldview that is oft unshocking to the modern mind. Their rejection of Christmas was based on a few deeply held beliefs. First, and most importantly, they argued that there was no biblical justification for celebrating Christ's birth on December 25th. They correctly pointed out that the date is not mentioned in the scriptures and was likely chosen by the early Roman Church to co-minus of the popular pagan winter solstice festival, Saturnalia. To the Puritans, this made Christmas a human invention, tainted by pagan and Catholic traditions, and therefore an abomination. Second, they were repulsed by the way Christmas was celebrated in England. For them, it was not a quiet, family-focused holiday. It was a period of misrule, a time of public drunkenness, gluttony, gambling, and licentious behavior. It was everything their orderly, sober society was trying to escape. They saw Christmas festivities as a direct threat to their moral project. So on December 25th, you wake up and go about your work as usual. The town leaders make a point of it. The constable walks the streets, ensuring that no one is for bearing labor. The sounds of axes and hammers are deliberately loud, a public declaration of their rejection of the holiday. To be seen sitting idly by your fire would be an act of defiance. This anti-Christmas stance led to some wonderfully strange and specific prohibitions. For instance, the simple act of baking a mince pie was considered deeply suspect. Mince pies, with their rich combination of meat, fruit, and spices, were a traditional Christmas delicacy in England. In New England, they became a symbol of the very sensual feasting the Puritans despised. A woman caught baking a mince pie in late December would be viewed with extreme suspicion, as if she were smuggling a piece of popish idolatry into her kitchen. The historical debate on this issue is fascinating. Was the Christmas ban purely a theological statement, or did it also serve a social and political purpose? Some historians argue that the ban was a powerful way for the Puritans to define themselves as distinct from, and morally superior to, the Church of England and the society they had left behind. It was a form of cultural warfare. By working on Christmas Day, they were making a bold statement about their identity and their mission. It was a way of saying, we are not like them. We are purer, more serious, more biblical. Others suggest that there was also an element of social control involved. The misrule of an English Christmas often involved the temporary inversion of social hierarchy. Servants could mock their masters, and the poor could demand charity from the rich. This kind of social instability was terrifying to the Puritan leadership, who believed in a rigid, God-ordained social order. Banning Christmas was also a way of banning this potential for social chaos. You find yourself thinking about the sheer determination it took to erase such a deeply ingrained cultural tradition. You see a young boy wistfully looking at a sprig of holly with its bright red berries, a plant intrinsically linked to the forbidden holiday. His mother quickly pulls him away, scolding him. The natural world itself seems to hold reminders of a joy that is now outlawed. The ban on Christmas was not the only holiday they rejected. They also forbade the celebration of Easter and all of the various saints' days that filled the Anglican calendar. For them, the only truly holy day was the Sabbath. Every other day was for work and prayer. The great irony, of course, is that the Puritans' attempt to stamp out Christmas ultimately failed. As the colonies grew and more non-Puritan immigrants arrived, the pressure to conform began to weaken. The law was eventually repealed in 1681, but the cultural stigma remained for a long time. In fact, Christmas wasn't declared a federal holiday in the United States until 1870. The ghost of the Puritan ban lingered for nearly 2 centuries. As dusk falls on this cold December day, you sit by your fire, eating your simple meal of corn mush. There are no carols, no gifts, no special feast. There is only the wind howling outside and the knowledge that a simple expression of seasonal joy could cost you 5 shillings and earn you the condemnation of your entire community. It's a lonely feeling. You have been stripped of a holiday, a piece of your own cultural memory, and you realize, with a heavy heart, that, in their quest to build a city for God, the Puritans have outlawed one of the most human things of all, a season of hope in the dead of winter. Living under this constant scrutiny, this web of written and unwritten rules, you begin to feel a sense of bewilderment. Why? Why this level of control? Why punish a clumsy Poe, a more sleeping man with such public fervor? From your modern perspective, it seems excessive, even absurd. But as you spend more time here, observing and listening, You start to piece together the internal logic that underpins this entire system. It is a logic born of fear, faith, and a desperate need for order in a chaotic world. The key to understanding it all lies in a single, powerful idea: the covenant. The Puritans believed they had a special agreement, a covenant with God. They saw themselves as the new Israelites, fleeing a corrupt England, their Egypt, to build a new Jerusalem in the American wilderness. The terms of this covenant were clear: if they, as a community, remained pure, obeyed God's laws, and lived righteously, God would bless them with prosperity, health, and safety. But if they failed, if they allowed sin to fester in their midst, God would withdraw his protection and punish them all. This was not an individualistic faith. It was a collective one. Your private, personal sin was not just your problem. It was a threat to the entire community. Your idleness, your vanity, your profane joke, these were cracks in the foundation of the city upon a hill. If enough cracks appeared, the whole structure could come crashing down, bringing divine wrath in the form of disease, failed harvests, or attacks from the native tribes they so feared. You see this logic play out after a fierce autumn storm damages several roofs and flattens a portion of the cornfield. The Sunday after, the minister's sermon is not about rebuilding or practical matters. It is a thunderous inquiry into the town's spiritual failings. Which of our sins has provoked the Lord to this anger? He roars from the pulpit. Who amongst us has harbored pride in their heart? Who has been lax in their duties? We are being punished, and we must look inward to find the cause. This is why the public punishments are so crucial. They are not just about deterring crime. They are a form of ritual purification. When Thomas is put in the stocks for his boisterous joke, the community is not just shaming him. They are performing a public act of penance. They are demonstrating to God that they are taking sin seriously. They are saying, "See, we have found the sinner. We have punished him. We are cleansing ourselves. Please do not punish us all for his transgression." The stocks, the letters, the dunking stool, they are all instruments in a desperate, ongoing negotiation with a fearsome and demanding deity. This covenant theology also explains the obsession with outward appearances. It wasn't enough to be pious on the inside. Your piety had to be visible, demonstrable. Your plain clothing, your industriousness, your solemn face on the Sabbath, these were all public signals, both to your neighbors and to God, that you were holding up your end of the bargain. This is where the concept of the visible saint comes in, a core doctrine of Puritan belief. To become a full member of the church, you had to stand before the congregation and give a convincing personal testimony of your own conversion experience, proving to them that you were one of God's chosen saints. Your inner spiritual state was subject to public review and approval. This leads to a deeply weird and specific practice you learn about the relation. This was the formal name for the conversion narrative. It was a highly stressful and formulaic performance. A person seeking church membership would have to describe their journey from sinfulness to grace, hitting all the right notes of despair, repentance, and eventual hope in salvation. The elders in the congregation would listen, judging the sincerity of the testimony. If it was deemed unconvincing, membership was denied. This created immense psychological pressure, as some historians argue, likely led to a great deal of coached or even feigned religious experience. The historical debate here is central to understanding the Puritan soul. Were these people engaged in a genuine, collective spiritual quest, bound together by a profound and shared faith in their divine mission? Or were they trapped in a system of holy hypocrisy, where the immense social and political pressure to conform led most people to simply perform the role of the pious Puritan, while their inner lives remained a separate, private matter? Historians like Perry Miller have famously argued for the depth and sincerity of the Puritan intellectual and spiritual project, seeing it as a grand, if flawed, attempt to build a truly godly society. Other, more revisionist historians, however, focus on the social and economic motivations. They argue that the covenant was also a convenient ideological tool for the ruling elite to maintain power, enforce social cohesion, and justify their authority. By framing their leadership as divinely ordained, they made any challenge to their rule not just a political act, but a blasphemous one. You see both sides of this argument in the faces around you. You see the genuine, fervent belief in the eyes of the minister and the elders. You see the anxious conformity in the eyes of your neighbor, Goodwife Miller, who seems to find spiritual satisfaction in policing the behavior of others, and you see the weary resignation in the eyes of a man like Silas, the punished poet, who has been broken by a system he doesn't seem to believe in but is powerless to resist. You are not a theologian or a magistrate. You're just trying to survive. But, understanding this core logic, that your personal life is a public matter of cosmic importance is the key. The fear you feel every day is not just the fear of your neighbors. It's the fear of their fear. You are afraid of triggering their terror of God's wrath. And so you conform. You keep your head down. You work hard. And you make sure your spiritual performance is flawless. Because in a society built on a covenant, one misstep doesn't just risk your own soul. It risks the entire world. Your understanding of the Puritan legal system is pieced together from whispers, public spectacles, and sermons. But one day, you get to see it up close. A dispute over a stray pig that wandered into a neighbor's garden has escalated into a formal accusation of theft, and the case is being heard by the local court. You, along with other townspeople, are allowed to observe. The court is not held in a grand, imposing building. It convenes in the main room of the meetinghouse, or sometimes in the largest room of the magistrate's home. The space is reconfigured, with a table at the front for the magistrates and benches for the public. There is no pomp, no ceremony, no barristers in wigs and robes. It is a stark, practical affair. At the front sit the judges. These are not professional, legally trained judges in the modern sense. They are the town's leading citizens, the governor, the deputy governor, and a few assistants or magistrates, men like your town's own stern leader. They are respected elders, successful landowners, and pillars of the church. Their authority comes not from a deep knowledge of legal precedent, but from their social standing and their perceived guidelines. The line between church and state is not just blurry here. It is non-existent. The two men involved in the dispute stand before them. The accuser, a farmer named John, presents his case first. He explains how he saw his neighbor, William, chasing the pig out and then deliberately guiding it towards his own pen. Then, John's wife is called to testify. She corroborates his story. Another neighbor is called, and he says he heard a pig squealing from the direction of William's house. Now it is William's turn to speak, and here you notice something startling. There is no defense attorney. The concept of a defendant having a right to legal counsel did not exist here. William must defend himself. He stammers, trying to explain that the pig ran into his yard by accident. He was merely trying to secure it until he could find the owner. He has no witnesses to back up his version of events. The magistrates listen. Their faces impassive. They ask a few sharp, probing questions. Their questions are not just about the facts of the case, but about the character of the men involved. Is John known to be an honest man? Is William known to be lazy or covetous? In this system, your reputation is your most important legal asset. A history of piety and good behavior is your best defense. This reliance on reputation and witness testimony leads to a strange and problematic feature of Puritan justice, the 2- witness rule. Based on a passage from Deuteronomy, many colonial courts required the testimony of at least 2 eyewitnesses to convict someone of a capital crime. On the surface, this sounds like a protection for the accused, but in practice, it created a perverse incentive for accusers to find, or even coerce, a second witness, and in lesser cases, the evidence was often just hearsay, gossip, and personal animosity dressed up as righteous testimony. After less than an hour, the magistrates confer among themselves in low voices. The head magistrate then delivers the judgment. William is found guilty. His denial is seen as less credible than the testimony of his 3 neighbors. He is fined the value of the pig and is also ordered to make a public confession of his sin of covetousness during the next Sunday service. The verdict is swift, final, and absolute. There is no lengthy appeals process. Justice, like everything else here, is brutally efficient. The entire proceeding is a stark illustration of a legal system based on what historians call magisterial justice. The law was not a fixed, objective code to be neutrally applied. It was a tool in the hands of the magistrates to enforce morality and maintain social order as they saw fit. Their personal judgment, their interpretation of the Bible, and their assessment of a person's character held immense weight. This leads to a fierce and ongoing debate among legal historians. Was the Puritan legal system a primitive, biased system that delivered arbitrary and often cruel justice? Or was it a surprisingly flexible and effective system for a small, ideologically minus-driven community? Some scholars point to the lack of procedural safeguards, the merging of church and state, and the reliance on subjective evidence as proof that it was fundamentally unfair. They argue that it was a system designed to protect the interests of the established elite and to punish dissenters. However, other historians argue that we shouldn't judge it by modern standards. They point out that Puritan courts were often more accessible and less expensive than the courts in England. They also dealt with a wide range of civil matters, from contract disputes to land inheritance, often with a degree of common minus and pragmatism. They argue that while the criminal punishments were harsh, the system's primary goal was to resolve disputes and restore community harmony, not just to punish. In their view, it was a system that, for all its flaws, worked for the specific type of society they were trying to build. As you leave the meeting house, you feel a profound sense of vulnerability. You realize that if you were ever accused of a crime, your fate would rest entirely in the hands of a few powerful men. It would depend on what your neighbors thought of you. It would depend on their interpretation of your actions, your words, and the state of your soul. There would be no impartial advocate to speak for you, no presumption of innocence as you would understand it. You look at William, the convicted pig-thief, standing alone, his head bowed. He has not only lost his case, he has lost his standing in the community. He is now a mocked man. And you understand that the courtroom here is not just a place where facts are weighed. It is a stage where reputations are made and destroyed, and where the line between a legal judgment and a moral condemnation is impossible to see. For years, the rigid order of the town holds. Their rules, though oppressive, create a predictable, if grim, stability. But as the first generation of settlers grows older and the new generation, born on this new soil, comes of age, you begin to see subtle, hairline cracks forming in the solid wall of Puritan conformity. The rebellion, when it starts, is not a riot or a revolution. It begins with a flash of color. It starts with the young people. They did not cross the ocean for a divine mission. They did not experience the persecution in England. This stern, restrictive town is the only world they have ever known, and they are beginning to strain against its confines. You see it in small, fleeting moments of defiance. You see a young man, the son of a pious farmer, who has let his hair grow just a little too long, a fringe of it curling over his collar in a way that would have scandalized his father a decade ago. You see a group of teenage girls whispering and laughing together behind the meeting house, their laughter cutting off the moment an adult appears. You see an apprentice who has carved a small, decorative pattern onto the handle of a tool, an act of vain artistry that he quickly hides when his master approaches. But the most visible form of this quiet rebellion is, once again, clothing. Despite the some PT, fewer laws in the sermons against vanity, a trickle of new goods and new ideas is beginning to seep into the colony from the world outside. Young men who work on the docks in Boston or Salem see sailors in brightly colored shirts. Young women hear tales of new fashions from England, and they begin to experiment. One Sunday, you see it clearly. A young woman named Mercy, the daughter of a well-to-do merchant, walks into the meeting house. Her dress is still a modest, dark color, but she is wearing a hood lined with a vibrant, deep blue silk. It's just a sliver of color, but in the sea of drab wool and linen, it's as shocking as a firework. A collective, silent gasp seems to ripple through the older women on their side of the aisle. The minister glares from the pulpit. Mercy keeps her eyes demurely lowered, a perfect picture of piety, but her silent statement has been made. She is young, She is fashionable, and she is not afraid. This phenomenon, known to historians as the crisis of the second generation, was a major challenge for the Puritan leadership. They saw their children and grandchildren becoming more interested in worldly success in land, in commerce, in personal comfort than in the state of their souls. Church membership began to decline because fewer and fewer young people were able to produce the kind of dramatic, soul-bearing conversion narrative that was required to become a visible saint. This led to one of the most controversial and telling compromises in Puritan history, the half-way covenant, proposed in 1662. It was a way to keep the younger generation connected to the church. It allowed the children of full church members, the grandchildren of the original settlers, to have their own children baptized, even if they themselves had not had a personal conversion experience. They were granted a kind of half-way membership. They couldn't take communion or vote in church affairs, but they and their children remained within the fold. The debate over the half-way covenant was fierce and divisive. It raged for years. The hardliners saw it as a terrible dilution of their core principles, a betrayal of the high standards set by the founders. They believed it would pollute the church by admitting unregenerate members. The pragmatists, however, argued that it was a necessary evil. They feared that without it, the majority of the population would soon be outside the church entirely, and the Puritan mission would wither and die. The eventual adoption of the half-way covenant is a subject of endless debate among historians. Was it the beginning of the end for the Puritan experiment, a fatal compromise that sacrificed spiritual purity for institutional survival, or was it a savvy and necessary adaptation, a sign that the society was maturing and finding a way to balance its rigid ideals with the messy reality of human nature and generational change? You see the effects of this change all around you. The young people are different. They have a different look in their eyes. It's not the grim, unyielding resolve of their parents. It's something more complicated, a mixture of respect for the old ways and a restless hunger for something new. They are the first Americans, in a sense, caught between the European past of their parents and the unknown future of this continent. The tavern becomes a little louder. The songs are a little more cheerful. You see a young couple holding hands for a moment too long in the twilight. These are small things, but they are significant. They are signs that the monolithic, all-minus encompassing control of the first generation is beginning to fray at the edges. The founders wanted to build a perfect, static city upon a hill, a timeless monument to their faith, but they forgot that cities are built by people, and people change. You watch Mercy with her blue-lined hood. She endures the glares, the whispers, the inevitable concerned visit from the tithing man to her father. But the next week, you see another girl with a small, colored ribbon on her basket. The cracks are spreading. The world is changing, not with a bang, but with a whisper of silk, and you wonder if the elders, in their desperate attempt to hold back the tide, will be forced to resort to even more desperate measures. The cracks you've noticed, the generational tension, the quiet rebellion, the fear of declining piety create a powder keg of social anxiety. The leaders of the colony are terrified that they are failing in their covenant with God. The sermons become more and more frantic, filled with warnings of divine wrath and the insidious work of the devil. All that is needed a single spark. And in the winter of 1692, in the small, insular village of Salem, that spark is lit. It begins, as it so often does, with a group of young women, the daughter and niece of the village minister, Reverend Paris, along with several of their friends, start exhibiting strange and terrifying behaviors. They have convulsive fits. They scream uncontrollably. They claim to feel pinching and biting from unseen forces. The local doctor can find no physical cause. In a community primed to see the devil's hand in every misfortune, the diagnosis is swift and terrible. They are bewitched. The pressure on the afflicted girls to name their tormentors is immense. And they do. They point their fingers at three women on the margins of society: Tituba, Reverend Paris's enslaved servant from the Caribbean; Sarah Good, a homeless beggar; and Sarah Osborne, an elderly woman embroiled in disputes over her late husband's estate. What happens next is a terrifying departure from the legal norms you have, until now, understood. The initial examinations of the accused women are not sober, fact-minus finding inquiries. They are public spectacles of pure hysteria. The magistrates, John Hatton and Jonathan Corwin, hold the hearings in the packed meetinghouse. They have already presumed guilt. Their questioning is aggressive, leading, and designed to elicit a confession. You watch, horrified, as the afflicted girls writhe and scream in the front rows every time one of the accused women speaks. They claim the specters of the accused are tormenting them. Right there in the meetinghouse. This is the introduction of spectral evidence, a concept that will be the legal engine of the entire tragedy. Spectral evidence was the testimony of the afflicted that they had been harmed by an apparition of the accused person. It was, by its very nature, impossible to disprove. How can you defend yourself against something a person claims your ghost did while you were asleep in your bed? The acceptance of spectral evidence is one of the most controversial and debated aspects of the Salem witch trials. Was it a genuine, if tragically misguided, belief on the part of the magistrates, who felt they were fighting a literal war against Satan? Or was it a cynical tool, a way to secure convictions when no other evidence existed? Many historians argue that the magistrates, particularly Hatton, were true believers who felt the weight of the world on their shoulders. They saw themselves as soldiers of God pushing back a demonic invasion. Others, however, suggest that the crisis was quickly co-adopted by individuals looking to settle old scores. The accusations soon spread beyond the initial 3 women, targeting anyone who had enemies, owned desirable property, or had a reputation for being somehow different. A particularly strange and little-known fact from the trials is the touch test. During the examinations, if the afflicted girls were in the throes of a fit, the accused person would be brought forward and forced to touch them. If the girls' fit immediately ceased, it was taken as proof that the accused was indeed the witch, as they had reabsorbed the malevolent force they had sent out. It was a piece of superstitious theater, a supposedly scientific experiment that was, in reality, a form of psychological coercion that almost always proved the guilt of the accused. The situation spirals out of control with breathtaking speed. The accusations fly. Respected church members, wealthy landowners, even a former minister, are accused and arrested. The prisons fill with people from Salem and surrounding towns. To deny being a witch is to be found guilty, because the girls' spectral torments continue. The only way to save your life is to confess to being a witch and to name other witches. This creates a devastating feedback loop of accusations, fueled by fear, jealousy, and a desperate desire for self-preservation. This special court convened to hear the trials. The court of oyer and terminer steamrolls over any semblance of due process. 19 people, men and women, are convicted and hanged on Gallows Hill. One elderly man, Giles Corey, who refuses to enter a plea, is subjected to an archaic form of torture called peine forte d'or, where he is slowly pressed to death with heavy stones. It is a level of brutality and panic that shocks the conscience, even by the harsh standards of the 17th century. The Salem crisis represents the absolute zenith of the Puritan mindset you have been living in. It's the terrifying, logical conclusion of a world where public shaming is entertainment, where neighbors are spies, where the court system is based on reputation, and where a collective terror of God's wrath bubbles just beneath the surface. It is the moment when the fear that has held the society together turns inward and begins to devour itself. You watch from a distance, thankful not to be in Salem. But you feel the chill of its madness spread throughout the colony. No one feels safe. Any personal grudge, any misunderstood word, any eccentric habit could be the basis for a deadly accusation. The system of social control you have come to know has metastasized into a monster. And as the bodies pile up, even some of the most ardent leaders begin to wonder if they have made a terrible, irreversible mistake. The hysteria of Salem burns itself out as autumn turns to winter. The governor, prompted by his own wife, being accused and by the rising chorus of criticism from influential Boston ministers like Increase Mather, finally steps in. He dissolves the court of oyer and terminer and forbids the use of spectral evidence in the new court. Without it, The prosecutions collapse. The accused are acquitted or pardoned. The jails are emptied. The fever breaks. But the silence that follows is not one of peace. It is the hollow, aching silence of shame. The community slowly, painfully, begins to reckon with what it has done. It is a reckoning that will take years. Judges and jurors issue public apologies. One of the most famous is from Samuel Saul, one of the Salem judges, who stands up in church while his minister reads his confession, accepting the blame and shame of the affair. And Putnam Jr., one of the leading afflicted girls, offers a public apology years later, claiming she was deluded by Satan. The town of Salem is less shattered, its reputation permanently stained. Families have been destroyed, neighbors turned against each other, and the moral authority of the magistrates and ministers is deeply, irrevocably damaged. The witch trials are a profound trauma from which the Puritan experiment in New England will never fully recover. In the years that follow, you witness a slow but undeniable shift in the atmosphere. The old, unshakable certainty begins to erode, replaced by a new, cautious humility. The punishments you once saw as commonplace start to seem antiquated, even barbaric. In the shadow of Gallows Hill, the stocks and the pillory are used less and less frequently. The public still gathers for punishments, but the mood is different. There's less righteous fury, more a sense of grim, weary duty. The idea of public shaming as a form of community purification has been poisoned by the memory of Salem, where public accusation led not to repentance, but to murder. The wearing of letters, that vivid alphabet of shame, also begins to fade away. The scarlet and its kind become relics of a harsher, more zealous type. This is partly because the society is becoming more complex, more urban, more anonymous. In a growing city like Boston, it's harder to police every citizen, but it's also a change of heart. The idea of permanently branding a sinner seems less like divine justice and more like human cruelty after the raw horror of the trials. This leads to a fascinating and obscure legal endpoint for these punishments. While the laws themselves might remain on the books for decades, their enforcement quietly withers. A judge might have the legal right to sentence a drunkard to wear a D, but he chooses not to, opting for a simple fine instead. This gap between the written law and its actual practice is where historians see the real cultural shift happening. The society outgrew its own punishments. The great historical debate is about what truly caused the end of this era. Did the Enlightenment, with its emphasis on reason, science, and individual rights, finally penetrate the walls of the city upon a hill and vanquish the old superstitions? Or was the decline of the Puritan way an internal process, a slow collapse under the weight of its own contradictions, with Salem as the final, fatal symptom of its sickness? Most historians argue it was a combination of both. The intellectual currents of the Enlightenment certainly provided a new language and a new framework for a more tolerant, less dogmatic society. But the trauma of Salem was the crucial catalyst. It was a homegrown disaster, a failure of their own system. They had followed their own rigid logic to its terrible conclusion and found not God's kingdom, but a landscape of corpses and broken trust. It forced a generation to question the very foundations of their world. You see the change in the small details of life. You see Mercy's blue-lined hood, which once seemed so daring, become commonplace. You see men conversing on the street, laughing without looking over their shoulders. You hear new ideas being discussed, new books being read. The iron grip of the founders is loosening, not because of an outside invasion, but because their own children and grandchildren are choosing a different path. The old world doesn't vanish overnight. The meetinghouse is still the center of town, the sermons are still long, and the fear of God is still real. But something fundamental has shifted. The belief that they could create a perfect, pure society, a community of saints free from sin, has died on Gallows Hill. You look back on your time here, on the journey from the muddy shore to this new, more complex world. You remember the tithing man's pole, the shame of the stocks, the scarlet letter, the terror of the dunking stool, the illegal joy of a Christmas carol. These were the tools of a generation convinced they had all the answers. No, you live among a generation that is beginning to understand that they don't even know all the questions. The letters have faded, but the memory of them, and the humanity they tried to control, remains. And so, the world you enter, so rigid and severe, slowly dissolves into something more familiar. The sharp edges of its laws begin to soften, worn down by time and by the quiet, persistent pulse of human nature. The need for a little color, for a private thought, for a moment of rest, could never be fully legislated away. The frantic energy of that city upon a hill begins to settle. The air itself feels lighter, as if a great pressure has been released. The whispers of neighbors are now more likely to be about the weather than about the state of your soul. The silence of the night is no longer filled with the dread of being watched, but with the simple, peaceful quiet of a town settling into a deepened dream-filled sleep. You can feel that gentle pull now, can't you? The pull of your own quiet truth, the weight of your eyelids growing heavy, the stories fading, like the scarlet letters on those old woolen coats. Its bright, sharp colors mellowing into the soft gray of memory. Let the details drift away. Let the faces of the magistrates and the ministers blur and recede. They are just ghosts now, figures in a tale that has been told. Their world of harsh rules and constant judgment can no longer reach you. You are safe in your own time, in your own space, where rest is not a crime, and sleep is a welcome friend. Let the gentle hum of the fan, or the quiet of your room, become the only sound. Allow your thoughts to slow, to stretch, to become as soft and comforting as the pillow beneath your head. The journey is over. It is time to rest.